Good afternoon. I am Steve Swain, a professor of music here at Dartmouth College and the director of the college's Montgomery Fellows program. Before I forget, for those of you who are not part of the immediate Dartmouth family, there is a form out front asking you for your name, email address, and phone number in case we need to engage in any contact tracing. Let's hope that won't be necessary. The Montgomery Fellows program brings exceptional people to an exceptional place. That exceptional place, of course, is Dartmouth College, but it is also the Montgomery House on Ockham Pond, which was purchased in 1977 through the generosity of Kenneth Montgomery, class of 1925, and his wife, Harl. Our fellow today is the college's 257th resident fellow who comes to share with us his life and wisdom. I have invited Professor Deborah Nichols to introduce today's fellow. Professor Nichols is the William J. Bryant 1925 Professor of Anthropology, and she also holds affiliations with the Ecology, Evolution, Ecosystems, and Society graduate program and with the Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies program, both here at Dartmouth. In addition to her academic appointments, Professor Nichols is the current president of the Society for American Archaeology, a society of more than 7,000 members. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nichols.
Thank you, Steve, and it's great to see so many of you in person for the first time in some cases. So it's my real pleasure today and also an honor for me to introduce Joe Watkins, who comes to us by way of the University of Arizona and a citizen of the Choctaw Nation. I want to take a moment, though, to thank the Montgomery Fellowship and Steve Swain and Ellen Henderson for all the work they've done behind the scenes to make Joe's visit and all those connected with the series, and I'm going to mention to you possible. The pandemic complicates everything, and I know that there has been a lot of work that's been done, and I particularly want to thank Ellen for what makes things actually happen here. I also thank each of you for coming today and for looking after each other with vaccines and masks and putting up with masks and not being able to see your smiling faces. Joe Watkins' career has spanned archaeology's breadth in the United States and in the international arena. He has been in the private sector as a consulting archaeologist, and many of you may not realize that much archaeology in the United States is done in what we call cultural resource management and in the private sector. He has been in the academy on the faculties of the University of New Mexico, the faculties of the University of Oklahoma, where he served as director of their Native American Studies program, and most recently with the University of Arizona. He has served in government where he has held various positions in the Department of Interior, including his last position as the supervisory, and this is only the government gives you a title like this, including the supervisory cultural anthropologist, chief tribal relations and American cultures program, and American Indian liaison officer of the National Park Service. And for many of you who may not be aware, the Department of Interior is the department of the US government under which much archaeology and national monuments and various agencies are under that larger umbrella of that department. And Joe in service has served for a number of societies, and most recently he was my predecessor as the president of the Society for American Archaeology. It is the largest society in this hemisphere, and we spent a lot of time in Zoom meetings together. Joe assumed that presidency, and then within half a year later, the pandemic would begin, and as much as your own individual lives in Dartmouth, it also upset the apple cart for the society as well, that has had to reconfigure almost everything we do and suddenly go from in-person operations to living in the virtual world. A connective thread of Joe's career and his many publications, and I'm not going to read you the bibliography, you can all Google it, has been the themes of ethics and archaeology's relations with indigenous and Aboriginal peoples. He leads this fall's Montgomery series in conjunction with the Dartmouth course, Who Owns the Past? This class grew out of a collective effort, the Dartmouth Archaeology Working Group, a kind of informal group of people interested in ancient history and archaeology that crossed the sciences, social sciences, humanities. and a grant that Julie Ruby in the Classics Department and I received, technically the APGAR Award for Innovation in Teaching, to implement an interdisciplinary course dealing with the most pressing ethical issues in archaeology. Who does own the past and who has the right to say and speak about it and do research on it and represent it? This year, the course is being taught by Jesse Casada in the Anthropology Department and Julie Ruby in the Classics Department, and it's being tremendously enhanced for the students by the Montgomery's Fellow Program. Joe is the first in a series of speakers that will be coming into this class, all internationally recognized leaders engaging with the students on important issues in the class. I think it is especially fitting that given Dartmouth's own history and its founding charter, and in the year 2021, which is the 30th anniversary of the passage of the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act that has significantly reshaped the practice of archaeology in the United States. The year in which we have the first Native American Secretary of the Department of Interior. It is really fitting that Joe Watkins lead off this series with his talk, Co-opting the Past, Recreating the Present, Politics and Archaeology. Please welcome me in joining Joe to Dartmouth.
Thank you, Deborah. 20 years ago was the first time, and perhaps the only time, I've been on the Dartmouth campus. Deb and I had a Winter Grand Foundation conference on archaeology at the turn of the century. And at that time, we were looking at various questions about whether American Indians had a particular view of the past or a particular hold on the past. We were thinking about what archaeology might be coming to be in its second or third century. We were also looking at ways that people interacted with the past. So today I'm going to explore a couple of issues that have grown out of that time and that conference. And I apologize if I move over here and then move back this way. I found that it's much more difficult to hit a moving target. So I got it. Yeah. First, sort of a brief outline of what my talk is going to be. I'm going to give a personal introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about indigenous archaeology, an explanation. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about nationalist archaeology, or the use of archaeology for nation building. Fourth, I will talk about a North American case study that looks at the politics of the past. It'll be a Paleo-Indian case study. Paleo-Indian is the name applied to the very first people that we find archaeologically in the New World, North America and South America. And finally, I will hopefully come to some cogent conclusions, and then we will open it up for questions and conversation. My name is Joe Watkins. I am a member of the Choctaw Nation, and generally I like to open my presentations in my native language. Halitochukmasia Joe Watkins, Choctaw, Oklahoma. I said, hello, I am Joe Watkins. I'm a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. I asked how you were doing and hope you were doing well. On my father's side, my family is the Watkins and Willis families. On my mother's side, it's the Hills and the Flowers families. Surprisingly, my father was the full-blood Choctaw, and I don't know how we got a Welch last name. Watkins is Welch, and from what I understand, it's a very well-respected name in Wales, but I don't know how it got to the Choctaws in southeastern Oklahoma. As Deb says, I have been doing archaeology for more than 50 years. I did my first archaeological survey in 1968, actually the year before I had started at the University of Oklahoma the following year in 1969. I've worked in museums, state and federal agencies, private industry, and universities, and have found that the perspectives that each of those places have about the past, about archaeology, and about people's relationships with that foreign land, which is the past, varies depending on the kind of work you are doing. And I put this one up here because it's something I'm very proud to have served. I was the immediate past president of the Society for American Archaeology. The very first president of the Society for American Archaeology was an American Indian. And it really only took about 85 years before the next American Indian was elected president. So it's circular, cyclic, and it is something that I was very proud to have actually completed. We're going to be starting with indigenous archaeology. It can be conceived of as a response to the legacy of colonialism in archaeology. It's also a means of reflecting a broadening reconstitution of existing theory and practice, and is designed to make the discipline more relevant and more satisfying to descendant communities. It engages often simultaneously with issues relating to identity and ethnicity, the nature of knowledge, the flow of benefits derived from archaeological research, and different ways of knowing the world. It is about decisions and choices that people make, and it's very much a multifaceted endeavor in trying to explain the past. The term indigenous archaeology is a relatively recent development, although there is some overlap with long-standing attempts toward archaeology's more open engagements with its various publics, constituents, and so forth. The earliest known use of the term, I keep speaking down to the microphone, I apologize. The earliest known use of the term referred simply to Aboriginal versus European components of North American archaeological sites. And it's still, coincidentally, the primary usage in Australia. Basically, in Australia, it means the archaeology of the indigenous inhabitants of the continent. The term was not used with much consistency, at least not in its modern connotations, until the late 1990s, when George Nicholas and Thomas Andrews published a reference defining indigenous archaeology as archaeology done with, for, and by indigenous peoples. It was subsequently popularized in a minor little book called Indigenous Archaeology, American Indian Values and Scientific Practice, which critically explored the late 20th century relations between archaeologists and Native Americans, particularly in the context of reburial, repatriation, cultural heritage management, and resource management written broadly. More recently, George Nicholas has offered the first full definition, which is indigenous archaeology is an expression of archaeological theory and practice in which the discipline intersects with indigenous values, knowledge, practices, ethics, and sensibilities, and through collaborative and community-originated or directed projects and related critical perspectives. Indigenous archaeology now has become a common enough presence to warrant frequent mention in archaeology textbooks, despite the fact that some critics, indigenous or otherwise, dismiss it as political posturing. Indigenous archaeology is distinguished from other forms of archaeology that engage directly with descendant communities by its commitment to a particular ethnically defined population. In this, it is similar to feminist archaeology, which also has a comparable selective focus, but importantly, both indigenous archaeology and feminist archaeology include practitioners who are not indigenous or female, respectively. Of course, the notion of indigeneity is fundamental to indigenous archaeology, but the question of who is indigenous is always situational, necessarily framed in opposition to another entity, which historically has most often been a more dominant, colonizing society. Indigenous thus generally refers to formerly disempowered, disenfranchised, or colonized peoples, although this is not the case in some parts of the world. Arguments that the people of Ireland, China, or India, for example, are indigenous do have merit, but this falls outside of the realm of indigenous archaeology, as the term is employed here. In Central America, only a small percentage of the native-born population currently self-identifies as indigenous, clearly reflecting important political and social issues regarding identity and self-representation. Indigenous archaeology generally refers to projects and initiatives associated with, and especially those initiated by, indigenous and Aboriginal peoples in the United States, Canada, and Australia. It may also include some others, such as African Americans, who might be classified as descendant communities. However, expressions of indigenous archaeology also appear widely elsewhere, including parts of Africa, New Zealand, Northern Europe, Siberia, Central and South America, and Japan. This book, Being and Becoming Indigenous Archaeologists, provides a wide-ranging description of people throughout the world who practice archaeology and how they develop their careers and why they do what they do. Now, the history of anthropology has quite often been intertwined with the West's interest and fascination with the other. And foremost here in the United States were indigenous peoples scrutinized by these anthropologists. Many of the first modern anthropologists, if you will, were also directly involved with archaeological pursuits, which led them to work closely with members of Aboriginal communities in the late 19th through early 20th centuries. Much of the impetus for these studies was aligned with the idea of getting information from the local people before traditional lifeways were lost to progress. And the ethnographic, archaeological, linguistic, and biological data obtained have proved to be of immense value to anthropology and to many indigenous communities, especially in terms of language and language revitalization. But by the 1960s, the increasing move toward cultural revitalization and politicization, coupled with the rapidly approaching post-colonial, postmodern world order and changing public attitudes, contributed to the emergence of indigenous archaeology in North America. Indigenous peoples were not only demanding restoration of their lands and their rights, but also more control over their own affairs, including those relating to archaeological sites and other aspects of their cultural heritage. During the latter part of the 20th century, major changes took place in the relationship between indigenous peoples and the dominant society. In the United States, demands for tribal recognition, land rights, national sovereignty, and/or the acceptance of an ethnic identity and values were often as much inspired by cultural heritage issues as they were by calls for social justice and restitution. In the United States, for example, Vine Deloria Jr. clearly articulated many aspects of Native American dissatisfaction with anthropology, questioning the legitimacy and practice of anthropology and archaeology, and the callous treatment of ancient human remains by scholars and museums. Following a decade of growing social and political dissatisfaction, the emergence of the American Indian movement in the early 1970s also brought national attention to many concerns of Native American issues. Vine Deloria Jr. had a great impact on my career as an archaeologist. In August of 1969, Playboy magazine published excerpts of Chapter 4, Anthropologists and Other Friends, the chapter which gave a scathing critique of anthropology. As an 18-year-old bound college student, I only read Playboy for the articles. And it really called into focus the fact that many anthropologists made their livings on American Indians and rarely, if ever, gave back to the tribal communities. So this was a very critical time in that I started in anthropology at the University of Oklahoma the next month in September, wondering if I could be objective enough to be an archaeologist or if I could be Indian enough to survive archaeology. My college professors didn't think I could be objective enough. My American Indian friends didn't think I should be an archaeologist if I was an American Indian. So this book means a great deal to me and always has since it came out. In the early 1970s, articles, magazines, newspapers published by American Indian groups, such as this one, Akwesasne Notes, called into attention the concerns of American Indian tribes. Difficult to see, perhaps, but right here, the editors have written in the margins concerning this Indian skeleton, how long will we allow this kind of sacrilege to continue? Signed, your grandmother. So these sorts of things were really calling attention to the issues that American Indian tribes in general had with the practice of archaeology. Prior to this, most of the articles that appeared were things about early archaeological sites that exhibited spectacular preservation or something. But Akwesasne Notes, Wasaja, many American Indian newspapers were drawing attention to the concerns that they had. And increasing political clout from a sympathetic public resulted in the passage of federal legislation such as the American Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act in 1975 and the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. In other parts of the world, comparably significant legislation and court rulings on indigenous rights were passed in New Zealand with the Treaty of Waitangi Act in 1975, Australia with Mabo versus Queensland in 1992, and in Canada with Delgamuukw versus Regina in 1997. Three of the major themes that I've identified in looking at American Indian issues with archaeology relate to the treatment of ancestral remains, participation or not in archaeological or heritage management, cultural heritage and legislative concerns about ownership of cultural and intellectual property. These themes have resurfaced time and time again throughout the last 30, 40 years. Perhaps the most contentious aspect of archaeology in the view of many American indigenous peoples has been the treatment of human remains and burial sites. In the 1970s, American Indian movement and various groups held protests at archaeological excavations, gathering all the shovels, creating a large bonfire, burning field notes and the shovels. They also disrupted anthropology and archaeology classes in Colorado, 1970. They also started talking about such things as a death zoo where human remains were actually left on display so people could see the positions that the people had been left when they were buried, calling them educational exhibits. Also talks some of the early beginnings of discussions about repatriation. Thank you, Steve. And again, a lot of different fillers. Early Indians, only in America, Indian artifacts destroyed, and so on and so forth. So this was a time of major unrest, a time of growing politics, and a time when American Indians were getting more localized and more active to try to protect their culture, or the remnants of their culture as they were. In July 1971, this article here, talking about over Indian bones, this woman, Indian name Running Moccasins, her Anglo name was Maria Pearson. Her husband came home from work one day. He was a highway engineer, and said, at the highway site today, we found a pioneer cemetery. There were 28 individuals identified there. 26 of those individuals were excavated and taken to a funeral home to be reburied. The other 2 remains were identified as American Indian by beads and beadwork and other items in the graves. They were dug up and taken to the museum. So Maria was concerned, thought that the treatment was just irresponsible. She, dressed in her regalia, went and met with the governor and started talking about what could be done, what should be done. In 1976, Iowa passed the first state reburial law that allowed for human remains to be reburied in state cemeteries. The first cemetery was established in 1977. Ultimately, 3 other cemeteries were established where American Indian remains could be reburied after appropriate study, unfortunately. But this was the first example of a state working with tribal groups to rebury sets of human remains. Now, reburial and repatriation subsequently rose to national issues in the 1990s, some in response to the highly publicized looting of sites such as Slack Farm in Kentucky and other similar events in the Midwest. American Indians were extremely concerned that the general public was going out and pot hunting archaeological sites on Sundays as a family outing. And so American Indians actually started working with archaeologists to try to help pass state laws and national laws to prevent this sort of moonscape excavations. The adoption of the Vermilion Accord on Human Remains by the World Archaeological Congress in 1989, the passage of the National Museum of American Indian Act in 1989, and the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990 directly addressed indigenous concerns about the treatment of the dead, with scientific values no longer being given the primary point of reference. For perhaps the majority of archaeologists, the repatriation and reburial controversy was largely unexpected, and it caused great consternation and confusion within the discipline. Some very vocally wondered if NAGPRA marked the end of archaeology at the expense of political correctness, while others seem oblivious to it. In the years following the passage of NAGPRA, there was, and continues to be, widespread discussion about the goals and benefits of the scientific quest for knowledge relative to the need of the descendant populations to have at least some control over their own heritage. The debate rose to international prominence with the Kennewick Man, also known as the Ancient One, case from 1995 through 2005, which was significant not so much for revealing differences in attitudes towards research involving human remains between the groups as much as it did within the group. Over the last decade, much of the rhetoric has softened as cooperative and in some cases collaborative projects with indigenous communities have developed that involve ancient sites and human remains, and which in some instances have included radiocarbon dating and ancient DNA testing. No less important has been in the increased dialogue between archaeologists and Aboriginal communities as to the nature of archaeological research and the question of what constitutes heritage, who benefits from it, and how that benefit is determined. In relation to cultural resource management and heritage-related developments, care of ancestral sites has figured prominently in both the origins of and goals of indigenous archaeology. By the mid-1960s, the preservation of archaeological sites was increasingly a focus of attention of heritage legislation in North America and elsewhere. Formal tribal involvement in archaeology in the United States began with the Zuni Archaeology Program in 1975 and the Navajo Nation Historic Preservation Department in 1978. These were the first major initiatives to address specific concerns of indigenous peoples relating to cultural resource management, and also to provide archaeological training for the practitioners. During the 1980s and 1990s, state government agencies and indigenous organizations began to establish programs to train community members to monitor CRM projects. College and university level archaeology programs provided new opportunities for indigenous people, and it developed a wide-ranging set of skills that indigenous people brought to the practice of archaeology. In recent years, changes in heritage legislation in North America may require that archaeologists consult with indigenous governments and organizations and to adhere to established protocols and permitting systems for field and research projects in tribal territory. While well-meaning, this consultation is sometimes severely hampered by the ability of indigenous groups to respond to multiple requests for information at the same time, to provide comments on reports or actions, and in some cases, even to answer information requests, owing to limited human resources and other priorities confronting the community. Throughout the early parts of the 21st century, indigenous peoples have been able to achieve greater and more meaningful control over tangible and intangible cultural heritage through various avenues, although there have been regular setbacks when legislation has been changed or legal precedents overturned. In the United States, a 1992 amendment to the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 allowed tribes to establish their own tribal historic preservation offices, enabling direct tribal involvement in heritage preservation on tribal lands in relation to federal projects. In 2003, there were 35 THPOs. Currently, there are more than 200 federally recognized Tribal Historic Preservation Officer programs. In this way, tribal people are taking control over the archaeological enterprise on their own lands, and they are influencing archaeology. But this program is not really a tribal program. It's a federal program that the tribes are running. That means they are bound by federal perceptions about what archaeology is, what heritage can be managed, primarily archaeological or historic sites, and it doesn't really relate well to NAGPRA, language preservation, cultural revitalization programs. So it's not a good fit, but at least it's a start in the right direction. As the number of tribes taking over the control of federally funded or permanent archaeological projects on their lands have grown, the more the indigenous perspective gets inserted into the practice of archaeology. Though archaeology is not perfectly suited to tribal concerns, it does give the indigenous people a voice in the process, something that has become more politicized over time. In the United States, archaeology, although it has prided itself in the past as an objective scientific enterprise, is not without its faults. Or perhaps it might be more appropriate to say that it can serve as ammunition for those who wish to use it for political purposes. In the mid-19th century, people interpreted the mounds and enclosures of eastern North America as the works of a lost civilization, unrelated to American Indian cultures that inhabited this region at the time Europeans arrived on the scene. Mound builders was the rather unimaginative label applied to the mysterious people responsible for the numerous and diverse earthworks, and the myth was based principally on the perceived contrast between the scale and sophistication of the ancient architecture, which gave every indication of having been abandoned for centuries, and the generally small scale and apparently relatively culturally impoverished American Indian societies that were dwelling in the Ohio River Valley. In most versions of the myth, the mound builders were some non-Indian race from Europe, Asia, perhaps Atlantis, that built a magnificent in this hemisphere only to be overrun and obliterated by the ancestors of the savage American Indians. In 1989, archaeologist Don Fowler wrote, "The myth of the mound builders, which often served to denigrate American Indians, was never official government policy, but it did bolster arguments for moving the savage Indians out of the way of white civilization." Randy McGuire, another archaeologist, wrote that the scientists, through such conflicts as the mound builder controversy, unwittingly or perhaps not, worked to remove the Indians' ancestors from the history of the United States. By routing the red savages, the new civilized white American race inherited the mantle, the heritage of the old civilization. By the time archaeologists finally proved the mounds were products of the ancestors of American Indians, the Indians had been mostly dispossessed of their land. By calling into question the origins of the mound builders, American scientists also initiated questioning the origins of the American Indians that they were encountering. In the history of human movement, there are what are perceived to be major migration routes over time. We have the migrations coming out of Africa, where humans move into what we now consider the Near East, into the countries that we consider Europe down into Australia and so on and so forth. This slide shows one of the major migration routes into North America. The authors, Eske Willerslev and David Meltzer, provide this as a means of documenting the genetic populations and their movement from East Asia, across the Bering Strait, down along the Pacific coast, down into South America, Central America, and so on. This was what they considered to be the earliest migration into this hemisphere. We know that there are another couple of migrations later on in time. One that we get some groups that come in and settle in here, and then a later migration of people moving across over into Greenland, the Inuits as well. So I do want to draw attention to this spot here. Monte Verde is an archaeological site. It's the oldest clearly dated archaeological site in the Western Hemisphere, and it is at 14,600 years old. So it's kind of interesting that the oldest known site is so far down south, whereas in areas where we would expect the earliest to be, we don't find them yet. In the next year or two, there will be a NOVA special, if it gets completed, that might turn it upside down a little bit. So keep watching PBS and see. So the earliest inhabitants of North America, originally known as Paleo-Indians, were thought to have entered North America about 12,000 to 14,000 years ago, and to have created Native American Indian cultures over time. But in 1996, two people watching a hydroplane race on the Columbia River basically found a nearly complete skeleton of a human that dated to be more than 9,600 years ago. The Corps of Engineers, on whose land the skeleton was found, tried to repatriate the skeleton to a consortium of 5 tribes, the Colville, the Nez Perce, the Umatilla, the Yakima, and the Wanapum Band of Indians. But a group of scientists intervened, citing their scientific right to study the human remains. Known alternatively as the Ancient One or Kennewick Man, the skeleton set off a veritable tug of war over the earliest history of North America. After nearly 8 years, the district court held that the remains did not meet the definition of Native American under NAGPRA. Native American under NAGPRA is a tribe, people, or culture that is indigenous to the United States. The judge determined that is meant that they had to be able to show a direct connection. So it's kind of a false determination of that word, because we can say George Washington is the father of our country, or we can say George Washington was the father of our country. So with that determination that Kennewick Man was not Native American, the courts allowed the scientists to go ahead and study the remains. The remains lay at the Burke Museum for more than 20 years. On February 18th of 2017, the tribes were ultimately allowed to rebury those remains, but not under NAGPRA. The representative of the state of Washington actually passed or attached a rider to a law that directed the Burke Museum to give the remains to the tribes so that the tribes could rebury them. So Nagpur never really did kick in relation to the ancient one. These 8 archaeologists, biological anthropologists, sued the Corps of Engineers to be allowed to study, and they were actually able to complete their study. When the skull was first found, the person who examined it said that he thought that he had found a pioneer grave. The skeleton, the skull had characteristics that did not match American Indian characteristics. They were much more narrow, much more oval, much longer face, rather than American Indian generalized characteristics of the skull as a little bit rounder, flatter, and so on and so forth. When he reconstructed the skull, this is his reconstruction, he was misquoted. He called it Caucasoid, which is a biological anthropology grouping of one of the 3 groupings in relation to skull shapes: Negroid, Mongoloid, and Caucasoid. However, when he said Caucasoid, the press quoted him as saying Caucasian, which Caucasian implies race and not just characteristics. After this reconstruction, he actually had a eureka moment when he happened to turn on the television and see one of his favorite characters, Patrick Stewart, who played Jean-Luc Picard. So more recently, the scientists doing science on Kennewick Man have published their results in 2014. At 669 pages, it presents a compendium of information on the skeleton itself, as well as on a large number of other Paleo-Indian skeletons. The authors moved from a generic recreation of an ancient Paleo-American, the term they use, to one based on Ainu historic photographs. They did this because they say Kennewick Man's general similarity to Polynesians and the Ainu, again, based on physiology and nothing more. Even though they state it is not realistic to assert that Kennewick Man was, for example, an Ainu, the general public will probably not think that beyond that nuance. By bringing the term Ainu into the discussion, talking about a contemporary population from Japan, comparing it to an individual 9,000 years ago, it very definitely conflates the issue and starts bringing politics into the discussion. In a book published in 2003, written for young readers, Patricia Lauber talks about the possibility of immigrations brought up by other scientists, one that does not bring the earliest people into North America through the Bering Strait. She writes, many scientists are doubtful that people could have crossed the Atlantic. Even if they followed the edge of the ice, there was no place to pull ashore. Dr. Stanford agrees, but says it's important to explore the possibility that Europeans were among the first Americans. Now, she's talking about Dennis Stanford and Bruce Bradley, who in 2000 and 2002 hypothesized that the continent's first inhabitants may have crossed the northern Atlantic, beginning here in what we call the Iberian Peninsula. They base that hypothesis on the fact that some of the earliest archaeological materials, Clovis materials, at about 12 to 14,000 year olds, have a technological technique that is found and originated in an archaeological culture in what is now France at about 24,000 years ago. So they are proposing or hypothesizing that perhaps some people from Europe, what we call Europe, got in their boat and skirted the edge of the ice, living on the ice, hunting sea mammals, fishing, and then made their way into what is now North America. We do have a Norse settlement about 1,000 years ago up here in Newfoundland, so such long-distance voyages are possible. And there are examples of people actually crossing the Atlantic in small boats, not sailboats or motorboats, but some people actually being blown across, as it were. According to Stanford and Bradley, Solutrean populations could have settled along the eastern seacoast, and then over the next 6 millennia, their hunting and gathering culture may have spread as far as the American deserts and Canadian tundra, and perhaps even into South America. So that's two possibilities. The most generally accepted possibility of people coming into the Western Hemisphere via the Bering Land Bridge or that area, coming from what Dennis is talking about, Europeans coming to America. There's a third option, a proposal that at the time of the last glacial maximum, when a great deal of seawater was tied up and glaciers, ice caps, the distances between islands and between here would be much less. People could do it a little bit easier. And again, we have Monte Verde here, one of the oldest sites, but also over in this area of South America, we have this skull. Nicknamed Luzia after the famous Lucy. Walter Nevis and Pucciarelli have talked about the anatomy of her skull and her teeth. That Luzia looks more African or Australia Asian in visage. Of course, by using this color clay instead of a white clay, it also serves to politicize what you immediately think when you see the reconstruction. Also a little bit more of a Negroid, if you will, visage. So they propose that Luzia either traveled across the Bering Strait, following the coastline by boat, and then her ancestors lived in South America. He also thinks that her ancestors had lived in that area for 10,000 years without any sort of interbreeding. And so when they came into the New World, they still maintained a great deal of their original African genetics. So, again, there's that alternate migration route, either this way or this one. So these are just some of the archaeological questions and explanation for humanity's development in the New World. What about American Indian perspectives on the New World? In a class I taught at the Institute for American Indian Art in Santa Fe, I got involved in a discussion with a student, a Native American student, about these sorts of questions. She was angry and spoke about how scientists tell us that we've only been here 15,000 years. Now, I've always argued that, in fact, the first immigrants who came into the New World, regardless of whether they came from Australia or across the Bering Strait, were not Native American. They were Native Beringian, Native Polynesian, Native whatever you want to call them. But the first generation that was born here were the true ancestors of American Indians, Native Americans. They carried with them in their bones the minerals of the land that they were born to and born on. They were the parents of today's American Indians in a real sense, regardless of the scientific possibilities of multiple migrations or competing originating localities. And since American Indians were never anywhere else, they have been here since their time immemorial, so to speak. My own culture, the Choctaw, began at some point in the past when they recognized themselves as different from all the other groups who derived from the general southeastern archaeological culture known as Mississippian. Once they identified as Choctaw, their time clocks began. So that is time immemorial back to that beginning. Okay, so who were the first Americans? Well, there's the standard migration across by groups of people from northeastern Asia. There's that European Solutrean option, and then there's the Australians or maybe even Africans were the first inhabitants of the New World. But why is this important in this contemporary world? Numerous archaeologists have written extensively about archaeology and identity politics. Now, the plethora of options for peopling of the New World carry with them the possibility of some sort of Orwellian legerdemain, newspeak, doublethink, the mutability of the past. One such view, as espoused by right-wing columnist Lowell Ponte in an online blog titled Politically Incorrect Genocide, Part 1, written in 1999, places a very political perspective on the peopling of the New World. He writes, long before Christopher Columbus and other dead white evil European males, dweems in PC speak, conquistadors arrived to slaughter noble Native American Indians. The noble Native American Indians carried out a genocide that exterminated the true first Americans, who happened to have black skin and African racial origins. Using the information provided by Neves and Pucciarelli about Lucia, he went on to say, we have solid scientific evidence that among the earliest settlers of the Americas were people of African ancestry, people whose skin was presumably not red or brown, but ebony. Now, the same holds true when the Kennewick materials were erroneously reported as Caucasian in the popular press, especially when groups such as the Asatru Folk Assembly used the opportunity to practice their brand of paganism or Eurocentric supremacy. Lowell Ponte's view on this issue, written later in October 5th of 1999, is perhaps typified in this slide. On today's university campuses, the fashion is to depict Euro-Americans as evil and Native Americans and most Hispanic as virtuous survivors of white colonial exploitation, rape, and genocide. Kennewick Man might prove the opposite, that the true Native Americans were white, victims of murderous genocide by the ancestors of today's Indians who seized their land. The European invasion of the past 5 centuries in this potential revisionist history merely reclaimed land stolen 9,000 years earlier from their murdered kin. Kind of interesting. This can be likened to Orwell's Winston Smith musing, "All history was a palimpsest, scraped clean and reinscribed exactly as often as was necessary. In no case would it have been possible, once the deed was done, to prove that any falsification had taken place." Perhaps through a continued rescraping and reinscribing of history, Europe will gain legal control over Paleo-America, as it were, and the populations that might or might not have been descended from those early populations. Western scientists, by naming the populations from which native North Americans originate as European, Australian, or Africa, can further alienate the heritage of North America's indigenous peoples from contemporary Native Americans. Again, citing Orwell, surprisingly, I found I read Orwell a lot over the last 4 years. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. There are those who will see the issue of using contemporary geographical terms as unimportant in relation to the search for the original sources of the population of North and South America, or that such distinctions are inconsequential. But I disagree. In Stanford's statement that it's possible that Europeans were among the first Americans, the use of contemporary political definition carries a weighty implication. If the first people in North America were Europeans, it's not too large of a jump in logic for American politicians to say, well, if Europeans were here before anyone else, then American Indian claims to the land are negated or at least called into question. If American Indians really didn't have a valid claim to the land, then we don't have to honor any of the treaties we made with them. No treaties, no sovereignty, hey, no problem. Archaeologists are often delicate in choosing words to describe artifactual and particular situations. We've gone to great lengths to ensure that people understand that humans did not evolve from apes, but that humans and apes evolved from a common ancestor at a time in the deep past. Archaeologists agree that humans came into the North American continent from some other location, but the use of contemporary geopolitical terms in oversimplified statements such as Europeans were the first Americans runs the risk of creating the same sort of misunderstanding as saying humans evolved from apes. Politically, the origin of humanity in the New World should not matter, but it does. Perry Corrali, in the November 2001 Nationalist Free Press, wrote, "When the European settlers came over to this continent, what did they encounter? Savage mongrels. Take a cue from Kennewick Man, who was here long before them. His ancient bones cry out to us from the grave. Their message? Separate, preserve, and fight for your existence, white man. Otherwise, you will cease to exist. Act on these words and live." Now, these sorts of statements have abated over time, but they still come up in surprising places. Biological anthropologist Elizabeth Weiss, in a 2020 book titled Repatriation and Erasing the Past, can you get her perspective? Raised the idea that American Indians are opposed to scientific study of their ancestors only out of fear. She writes, reburial of individuals usually revolves around a desire to prevent the study of some of our earliest Americans. Perhaps Native Americans are concerned that their position as the first on this continent will be removed. Perhaps they are concerned that it will come to light that they replaced earlier peoples. Now, there are three problematic portions of this statement. One, study of some of our earliest Americans. Again, that says that anybody who is here in the past belongs to anybody here in America. Okay? The second term, talking about earliest Americans, well, America didn't exist 15,000 years ago. And this statement, when it will come to light that they replaced earlier peoples, they didn't replace earlier peoples. They are the earliest peoples. Even though DNA evidence in 2015 and in 2016 indicated that Kennewick Man was genetically closer to Native Americans than to any other groups, Weiss goes on to say, the repatriation and reburial of Paleo-Indians has led to allegations that the left are holding the true identity of the first Americans, who were Europeans. This conspiracy theory has been bouncing around since Kennewick Man made the news and has continued on far-right racist websites. But perhaps some of these allegations may be alleviated by more recent research. In June of this year, Eski Villerslev and David Meltzer published an article in Nature magazine titled Peopling of the Americas as Inferred from Ancient Genomics. In the article, they examined the most recent information taken from the genomes of numerous skeletons, not only in North America, but also in East Asia and Europe. Their conclusions are that all ancient individuals in the Americas, save for later arriving Arctic peoples, are more closely related to contemporary indigenous American individuals than to any other population elsewhere, which challenges the claim, based on anatomical evidence, that there was an early non-Native American population in the United States. Of course, people have to read this and they have to take it to heart. Otherwise, we will probably still continue to see some political posturing. Will this be enough to alleviate some of the right-wing politicians and the scientists who see the past as belonging to science without concerns for living people? I'm unsure. I've been concerned about these sorts of issues for the past 25 years, at least since the discovery of Kennewick Man, or the Ancient One. Science is expected to be objective and generally value-free, but there are times when perspectives carry with them these sorts of political, unexploded bombs that lay fallow for a while until dug up time and time again. For many American Indians, archaeologists and archaeology are viewed with scorn and suspicion. Indigenous archaeology provides an opportunity for tribes and tribal communities to take more control of the process of archaeology to benefit the community. But until such time as archaeologists defuse these sorts of political time bombs, archaeology will always be suspect. Thank you. That happened to me today, too. There it goes. You okay?
So we put up some microphones in the back of the room because this is being recorded. So if anyone has some questions, we ask you to use the microphone so it will record your question. And I'm happy to help Joe negotiate this so he has a chance to get a drink of water after a great talk. So do we have any questions from the audience?
Put everyone to sleep.
Or after a year or so on Zoom, the idea of asking a question in person is intimidating. Okay, I think, yes, you'll have to go up to the microphone.
I'm Inge Brown. I have a few thoughts on this subject. And one is concerns me is that all the stuff that I have read that archaeologists have done in this country is faulty because they refuse to go any further than that second Clovis point that they found, which wasn't the Clovis one. What was it called?
I'm uncertain.
They're just not digging deep enough. If they were to go deeper and deeper and deeper, they would find more. And I don't know why they're not digging any deeper.
Okay, that's very certainly a possibility. We do know that, as Dennis Stanford once said, that we do generally stop on the terraces, the first terraces overlooking the river. If we go back looking at older geological formations, we might find more material. Surprisingly enough, in Texas, last year, an archaeological site was found that dates to about 15,600. And the materials are nothing like Clovis. They're distinctly and they're different, but they don't fit in with the common perception of Clovis first. Some of it is, I hate to use the term a crapshoot, but that's really what it is, because people did not live on every set of land, every type of land. We generally know where to find them, and we have found them. So yes, in some ways, archaeology is flawed, but I was a part of a project in 1976 that we were looking at areas that would have been 20 to 25,000 years old, but we found lots of animal remains, but no associated human artifactual remains. The animals were there, but they hadn't been butchered. We found no cut marks, no stone tools. They might have been using bone. We know that bone can provide wonderfully sharp tools, but we didn't find any bone tools. So at this point in time, we are limited. Archaeology does rely on what we consider durable artifacts, stone, pottery, once pottery becomes made. We can't look at every possibility, but those that have examined landforms within those time frames have not found very many. So, as I say, there's something coming up within the next year that will help probably extend the time of human population in the New World back another 5,000 years. But that's just one. We don't know for sure when it's all going to come about, but we expect to find older materials. We certainly do.
Thank you very much, Professor Watkins. I'm from Utah originally and still follow what's going on there quite a bit. I'd love to hear your perspective on what's going on with Bears Ears and with other National Department of Interior sites. Some say that by protecting these sites, it brings so much more notoriety to them, which causes more looting in the end. So I'd love to just hear your perspective of what we do with some of these ancient indigenous sites and how do we truly protect them.
Thank you. I think the only way to truly protect them is to be able to provide a broad enough education to the people who are in the area so that they realize that it's important not to destroy them. Whether or not it relates to their own culture or the culture of the people who were there 1,000, 5,000 years ago. The people who live in the area have known about these sites, so drawing attention to it is not bringing anybody new to the area. It may be creating a commercial benefit to people to go out and to pot hunt the sites, the archaeological sites. I think that the Department of the Interior has been involved in trying to protect these large areas because primarily from oil and gas and economic development, primarily from having the lands destroyed through that sort of exploration. They're using the Antiquities Act of 1906, which allows the president to set aside lands of scenic beauty, scientific importance, and so on and so forth. I think the current Department of the Interior eventually will overturn the previous administration's restriction on size, primarily to open it up again for, if anything, for heritage tourism rather than extraction of natural resources. I'm glad to admit I don't have the political acumen to be a Secretary of the Interior. And I worked with, when I was in Washington, D.C., I got to work with a couple of secretaries of the Interior, directors of the National Park Service and such. And the politics involved is major. It's a major aspect of what their job is. The previous Department of the Interior Secretary, Ryan Zinke, many of you may remember that name, but he was very political, but he was not a good Secretary of the Interior because he really didn't care about protecting the natural environment that is the primary job of the Secretary of the Interior. It is a balance, but he was not good at it, but he was a political appointee. Deb Haaland, we are hoping that she will be good at it. I think many people expect that because she is American Indian, she's only going to have one perspective on it. But I do believe she will have a much more balanced perspective on what is necessary to protect the natural resources, the heritage resources, as well as trying to protect the people who live there. So maybe I tap danced around your question, but it's kind of my perspective on it. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks for your talk. I have a question. I was interested in the slide earlier that showed the number and the increase in tribal historic preservation offices.
Yes.
So, from my perspective, my tribe doesn't have one of those. We do employ an archaeologist who is a non-native guy. So I'm wondering about kind of a nuts and bolts question. How does it work in tribal nations where there are strong taboos against handling artifacts or remains, which I think is pretty common? I mean, is it like we do, get the white guy to touch the remains and the pots?
Sure.
How is indigenous archaeology done in that way, in those settings? I'm curious about that.
Well, some tribes do not have any prohibitions against touching objects of the past, either artifacts. Many tribes feel badly about individuals who touch human remains. In fact, the Choctaw, I've been to a couple of reburial ceremonies, and after the human remains have been put back into the ground, were brushed off, were smoked, and so on and so forth. So there are ways of regaining a center, or regaining a spiritual cleanliness that allow the repatriation of human remains. And I don't want to say that every tribe is different, but many are. The Zuni don't want to repatriate human remains from museums because they don't have a reburial ceremony. They believe there's no way to make it safe, either for the human remains to come back to the Pueblo or to make it safe for the Pueblo members from the human remains. So, but then there are others like the Hopi who say they will rebury any sets of human remains from west of the Mississippi. So some of it is based on obligations, either real or perceived obligations to the past, to the people, and so on. So it varies widely among tribal group. What tribe are you from? Okay. So many of the tribal historic preservation officers are non-Indian. And in some ways that's politically easier because you don't get tied up in the family politics, the tribal politics, which side, which clan, or anything like that. So, but indigenous archaeology, there are quite a few, there are probably 40, maybe 50 by now, American Indians with PhDs who practice archaeology. The first was Robert Hall in the 1960s. Second was Andrea Hunter, who's Osage. I was the third. For a time, I knew every indigenous archaeologist with a PhD. Now I don't, which is good. And like myself, I practice archaeology not necessarily as go out and dig up artifacts so I can find out about the past. I practice it. Currently, we are working in Japan with the Ainu, Japan's indigenous population, to try to help them lengthen the time back further into the past that they can indicate a presence of a group of people that had characteristics of contemporary Ainu. We're not trying to say, this is your history, and we can now give you your history back another 3,000 years than you had it before. But what we are saying is this is the kind of material we are encountering that indicates that probably this was an ancestral group of the group that was named Ainu by the Japanese government in the 1300s.
Isn't this inherently political as well?
Oh. Oh, it's totally political. It's totally political. And that's part of the issue is that the Japanese government, 1867 through 1890s, did everything they could to totally assimilate the Ainu. In 1897, the Japanese government passed the former Aborigines law that said, we have no more Ainu. They're just Japanese people. So, you know, go out there and be farmers, live long and prosper, whatever. But in the 1930s, the Japanese government, when they were expanding their empire into Asia, China, Korea, and such, actually decided that they were going to try to help the Ainu regain their distinctiveness. They were trying to develop governmental programs for education, health, economics. They failed at that miserably. But the Ainu, since the 1990s, the former Aborigines Act of 1899 was not repealed until 1997. In 2008, the Ainu were recognized as an indigenous population in Japan. In 2019, the Japanese government passed a new law stating that the Ainu were the indigenous population of Japan. So part of the issues, of course, is the Ainu does not have a political structure. They are primarily Ainu individuals who work within the system to try to help make it better for other Ainu to move forward. They have a history, they have the remnants of a language, they have culture, they have ceremony, but they don't have a political structure. They don't have a way of determining who is and who is not Ainu. The Japanese government says only the people who identify as Ainu on Hokkaido Island are Ainu. Anyone who moved from Hokkaido to Tokyo 50 years ago have lived there in Tokyo and continue to practice Ainu language and Ainu ceremony. They're not Ainu because they're not on Hokkaido. And the way they do the census in Tokyo, in Japan, on Hokkaido as a single prefecture, they basically say, they have local officials who say, well, I think we have 40 Ainu here. And then the next town over say, well, I think we have 35. They don't actually go out and provide an opportunity for the population to self-identify as Ainu or Waijin or Barukaman or whatever. It's the local officials who create the censuses of who is Ainu and who is not. So it's a broken system, and we were invited over in 2007 to try to help them come up with ideas about how to identify Ainu. They wanted to know about blood quantum, they wanted to know about descendancy, and DNA. Ainu genetically are different than the ethnic Japanese, the Yayoi, the Waijin, but genetics does not equal culture. So someone who had an Ainu allele is not Ainu if they have never felt Ainu or thought they were Ainu. So it's kind of work we're trying to do. I was supposed to be there this year working with the Hokkaido, with the government and the University of Hokkaido on these issues, but as with everywhere else, COVID-19 prevented that. So I'm hoping to be able to provide some guidance in the future, something that might benefit both the Ainu and their plight, if you will. So, but yes, it is political.
Have no further questions? With that, please join me in thanking Joe for a great afternoon.
Thank you. Please.